The last time I had spoken to my father before that invitation arrived, he had forgotten my birthday. Not just the date, he had forgotten I existed. I remember staring at my phone that evening, watching messages pour in from friends, coworkers, and even old classmates. Everyone seemed to remember, except the one person whose call I secretly hoped for every year. By midnight, I finally accepted the truth. My father wasn't going to call. Again, growing up, he hadn't always been like that. When I was little, he was my hero. He taught me how to ride a bike, coached my little league games, and carried me on his shoulders during county fairs. Back then, I believed nothing could ever come between us. Then my mother died. Cancer took her in less than a year. I was 14. My father changed almost overnight. At first, I understood he was grieving too. We both were. But instead of leaning on each other, he drifted away. A year later, he married Sandra. Sandra wasn't openly cruel. That would have been easier to fight against. Instead, she mastered the art of making someone feel unwelcome while appearing completely innocent. She would accidentally forget to set a place for me at dinner. She would schedule family outings and conveniently neglect to tell me. When relatives visited, she introduced me like a distant cousin instead of her husband's son, and slowly, painfully, my father stopped noticing. Or maybe he noticed and chose not to care. By the time I turned 18, I packed everything I owned into 2 duffel bags and left. Dad barely looked up from the television when I walked out. "Good luck," he said. Those 2 words were the closest thing to a goodbye I received. The years that followed weren't easy. I worked construction during the day and attended community college at night. There were weeks when instant noodles were all I could afford. I slept in tiny apartments with leaking ceilings. I drove cars that broke down more often than they ran, but every setback taught me something. Every failure pushed me harder. While other people saw obstacles, I learned to see opportunities. Eventually, I started a small consulting business. At first, it was just me and a borrowed laptop. Then came my first client, then my second. Within a few years, the company grew beyond anything I had imagined. The business expanded into multiple cities. Employees joined. Investors came calling. For the first time in my life, I felt proud of what I had built. Not because of the money, because I had built it alone, without family connections, without inheritance, without my father's help. Ironically, the more successful I became, the less I thought about him. The pain never disappeared completely, but it faded into the background. Until one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, my assistant walked into my office carrying an envelope. "This came by courier," she said. I thanked her and glanced down at the elegant cream-colored envelope. My name was written across the front in gold lettering. The return address immediately caught my attention. I froze. It was my father's address. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. After 15 years of silence, what could he possibly want? My heart pounded as I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a formal invitation. My father was retiring after nearly 40 years with his company. A grand retirement gala was being held at one of the city's most luxurious hotels. Business leaders, politicians, community figures, and longtime colleagues would attend. And at the bottom of the guest list was a name I never expected to see. Mine. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. For years, my father had acted as though I didn't exist. Now he wanted me at the biggest celebration of his life. I should have thrown the invitation in the trash. Instead, I sat there staring at it for nearly an hour, because despite everything he had done, a small part of me still hoped this was his way of saying he wanted his son back. For the next 2 weeks, the invitation sat on my desk. Every morning, I looked at it. Every evening, I told myself I wasn't going. Then the next morning, I would find myself staring at it again. My friends thought I was crazy for even considering it. After everything he put you through. My best friend Marcus asked, "People change." I replied, though I wasn't entirely convinced myself. Marcus shook his head. "Sometimes they do. Sometimes they just get older." His words stayed with me. Still, something inside me refused to ignore the invitation. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was the 14-year-old boy who never stopped wanting his father to choose him. On the night of the gala, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror adjusting my tie. I wasn't dressed extravagantly. I wore a tailored navy suit, polished shoes, and a simple silver watch. Nothing flashy, nothing designed to attract attention. I wasn't attending to impress anyone. I was attending because, for the first time in years, my father had invited me into his life. At least that's what I believed. The hotel ballroom was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Elegant music drifted through the air. Waiters moved between guests carrying silver trays filled with champagne. The room was packed with influential people, executives, business owners, local officials, retired colleagues. Everyone seemed happy. Everyone except my father. The moment he spotted me across the room, his smile vanished. I watched his expression change from surprise to discomfort, then to something that looked suspiciously like panic. For a second, I considered turning around and leaving, but I forced myself forward. "Dad." He stared at me awkwardly. "You came." The words didn't sound welcoming, they sounded concerned. I offered a small smile. "You invited me, right?" His eyes darted around the room. "Of course." An uncomfortable silence followed. I waited for him to ask about my life, my career, anything. Instead, he cleared his throat. "Listen, just try to keep things low. Key tonight." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "Nothing," he said quickly. "I just want everything to go smoothly." Before I could respond, Sandra appeared beside him. She looked exactly as I remembered: perfect smile, perfect hair, perfect ability to make people feel unwanted. Her expression tightened when she saw me. Oh, that single word carried 15 years of judgment. "Hello, Sandra." She forced a smile. "I didn't realize you'd actually come." The statement stung. Neither of them seemed happy to see me. I spent the next hour trying to enjoy the evening. I mingled politely, spoke with a few guests, congratulated former co-workers of my father. Yet every time I glanced toward him, I caught him watching me, not proudly, nervously, as if he were waiting for something terrible to happen. Eventually, near the middle of the event, he approached me again. Sandra followed close behind. Several guests stood near by chatting. My father lowered his voice. "Can we talk?" "Sure." He looked around before speaking. His expression was tense. "Maybe it would be best if you left." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. "What?" Sandra folded her arms. "We just think this event isn't really the right environment." I stared at both of them. I was invited. My father sighed impatiently. "I know." "Then why would I leave?" His jaw tightened. The answer came out colder than I ever imagined possible. "Because most of these people are important professionals." I felt my stomach drop. He continued. "They're executives, investors, and respected members of the community." The meaning behind his words was unmistakable. He still thought I was that broke teenager who left home with 2 duffel bags. He had never bothered to learn anything about my life, never asked, never cared. Sandra leaned closer. "It would be better if you went before things become awkward." I felt dozens of eyes beginning to drift toward us. Then my father delivered the sentence that shattered the last piece of hope I had brought with me. His voice was low, but loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Please leave before you embarrass me. The conversation around us stopped. The air seemed to freeze. My heart pounded. The room suddenly felt very small. For 15 years, I had imagined what it might feel like to reconnect with my father. I never imagined it would end with him asking me to disappear. And neither of us realized that within the next few minutes, the entire room was about to discover exactly who I had become. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My father's words echoed in my head. Please leave before you embarrass me. The sentence hit harder than I wanted to admit. Not because it was surprising. Deep down, part of me had expected disappointment. What hurt was realizing that after 15 years, he still knew absolutely nothing about me. The room around us had grown noticeably quieter. Several guests pretended not to listen, while clearly listening to every word. Sandra looked satisfied, as though the situation would soon resolve itself. All I had to do was walk away, and for a brief second I considered it. Maybe leaving would be easier. Maybe it would spare me another argument. Maybe it would finally close the chapter on a relationship that had been broken for years. Then a familiar voice interrupted the silence. "Excuse me." We all turned. A tall man in his 60s was making his way through the crowd. The moment I recognized him, I was surprised. It was Richard Bennett, one of the most respected investors in the state. His company had funded several major development projects over the last decade. More importantly, we'd worked together on multiple business ventures. Richard's face immediately brightened when he saw me. "There you are," he said enthusiastically. Before I could react, he extended his hand and shook mine firmly. "I've been looking everywhere for you." My father blinked. Sandra's confident expression disappeared. Richard laughed. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming." I smiled politely. "I almost didn't." Richard nodded. "Well, I'm glad you did." Then he looked toward my father. "You must be proud." My father looked confused. Proud of what? Richard stared at him. For a second, he seemed to think my father was joking. Then he realized he wasn't. The investor frowned. "Wait." His eyes moved between us. "You do know what your son has accomplished, right?" The question landed like a stone in still water. My father's face went blank. The nearby guests exchanged curious glances. Richard's confusion grew. Oh, that single word carried sudden understanding. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I assumed you knew." Before my father could answer, another voice joined the conversation. "Of course, everyone knows." A woman stepped forward. I recognized her immediately. She was the CEO of a regional technology firm that had partnered with my company. She smiled warmly. "Your son is one of the most respected entrepreneurs in the industry." More people began gathering around. The crowd seemed drawn by curiosity. Then another executive spoke. "My company wouldn't have survived the pandemic without his consulting team." Someone else nodded. "He created hundreds of jobs across the state." Another added, "And his foundation has funded scholarships for countless students." The comments kept coming, one after another. Business leaders, community organizers, investors, people my father clearly respected, people whose opinions mattered to him, all speaking about me, the son he thought would embarrass him. I watched his expression change with every sentence: confusion, disbelief, shock, then embarrassment. The same embarrassment he had feared from me, except now it belonged entirely to him. Sandra looked pale. For years she had treated me like an unwanted burden. Now she stood speechless as person after person praised accomplishments she never knew existed. Then the event organizer stepped onto the stage. She tapped the microphone. The room gradually quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, smiling, "we'd like to take a moment to recognize someone special." The spotlight swept across the ballroom. I immediately had a bad feeling. The organizer continued. Tonight's retirement gala would not have been possible without the generosity of a very important sponsor. Guests looked around curiously. My father glanced toward the stage, then the organizer pointed directly at me. There he is. Every head in the ballroom turned. The room fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. My father's eyes widened. Sandra looked as though she had forgotten how to breathe. The organizer smiled. Our anonymous sponsor requested no recognition, but I believe credit should be given where it's due. A screen behind the stage displayed my company logo. Gasps spread through the crowd. Please join me in thanking the individual whose contribution covered nearly half the cost of tonight's celebration. The silence lasted only seconds before applause exploded throughout the ballroom. People stood, some cheered. Others clapped enthusiastically. Meanwhile, my father simply stared at me, the son he had asked to leave. The son he believed would embarrass him. The son who had quietly paid for the very event being held in his honor. And in that moment, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, he finally understood how wrong he had been. The applause seemed to last forever. I stood frozen as hundreds of people filled the ballroom with cheers. The spotlight remained fixed on me, making it impossible to hide. That wasn't what I had wanted. When I agreed to sponsor the retirement gala, I specifically asked to remain anonymous. I hadn't done it for recognition. I hadn't done it to impress anyone, and I certainly hadn't done it to prove something to my father. I did it because, despite everything that had happened between us, he was still my father. A small part of me had hoped the event could become a new beginning. Instead, it had become a public lesson neither of us expected. Slowly, the applause faded. The guests returned to their conversations, though many continued glancing in our direction. My father remained motionless. For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty in the man who always believed he was right. His shoulders seemed smaller. His confidence seemed gone. The reality of what had happened was settling in. He had spent years assuming I was a failure, years believing I would never amount to anything, years judging a life he never bothered to understand. And now those assumptions had collapsed in front of everyone he respected. Sandra quietly stepped backward into the crowd. For once she had nothing to say, no clever remarks, no polite insults disguised as concern, just silence. My father finally took a slow step toward me, then another. His eyes looked older than I remembered. Not physically older, tired older, regret older. When he finally stopped in front of me, the room around us seemed to disappear. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "I'm sorry." The words were barely above a whisper. I searched his face. For years I had imagined hearing those words. In some versions, they felt satisfying. In others, they felt healing. But standing there now, they felt strangely empty. Not because I doubted his sincerity. Because apologies couldn't erase 15 years. They couldn't replace forgotten birthdays. They couldn't replace graduations he missed. They couldn't replace every moment I needed a father and found nobody there. Still, I nodded. I appreciate that. His eyes filled with emotion. I didn't know. I gave a sad smile. That's the problem. He lowered his head because we both knew the truth. He didn't know because he never asked, he never called, never visited, never cared enough to find out. Success wasn't the issue. If I had failed, he wouldn't have known that either. For years, I had been invisible to him. The difference now was that the entire room could see it, I thought. He began before stopping. "You thought I would embarrass you." I finished gently. His silence confirmed it. For the first time, I felt no anger, no desire to argue, No need to make him suffer. Life had already handled that part. The humiliation on his face wasn't caused by anything I said. It came from recognizing his own mistake. And somehow, that felt like the sweetest revenge of all. Not revenge built on cruelty, not revenge built on humiliation, but revenge built on truth. The truth that I had succeeded without his approval. The truth that I had become strong without his support. The truth that I no longer needed him to believe in me. Around us, guests continued celebrating. Music played softly. Glasses clinked. Laughter returned to the ballroom, but my father and I stood in our own quiet moment. Finally, he looked at me. Can we start over? The question hung in the air. I thought about the years we'd lost. The pain, the disappointment, the memories that could never be rewritten. Then I thought about something else. Holding onto resentment would only keep hurting me. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending everything was fine. It simply meant refusing to let the past control the future. I extended my hand. My father stared at it for a moment before shaking it. His eyes filled with tears, so I said with a small smile, "Happy retirement, Dad." He laughed softly through the emotion. For the first time in many years, there was no distance between us. As I walked out of the ballroom later that night, I realized something important. The greatest victory wasn't proving my father wrong. The greatest victory was proving to myself that I never needed his approval to become who I was meant to be. And as the doors closed behind me, I left with something far more valuable than revenge. I left with peace.